One day, Jesus' disciples went to him and said, "Lord, teach us how to pray." Jesus then gave them the words to what we now call the Lord's Prayer. Before he instructed them, I wish he had asked me for my advice. I would have given him different words. Are you comfortable with the Lord's Prayer? Do you ever find it unsettling or unnerving or disturbing? Many years ago, I knew a wonderful man by the name of J.E. He was a crusty old character, about 77 years old at the time. He was a veteran of World War II, gritty and fiercely independent. He was far right of Rush Limbaugh. One Christmas Eve, J.E. had open heart surgery. Over the next few months, he recuperated, he regained his strength, but then something happened. He started getting weaker and weaker. He lost some of his stamina. J.E. went to the doctor, tests were run, and he discovered that he had leukemia. He went to another doctor, a doctor that he greatly respected, and through his treatments, J.E. began to improve. But the treatments were grueling, and they took so much out of him. They left him so weak. One afternoon, J.E. and I were talking. We talked about this, we talked about that, and then we talked about his illness. Before I left, I said, J.E., would you like to have a word of prayer today? What would you like to pray for? J.E. looked at me, and with quivering lips, J.E. said, Patrick, please pray for me. That day, J.E. taught me something important about prayer in general and the Lord's Prayer in particular. The Lord's Prayer gets us in touch with those parts of our lives, those parts of ourselves that are weak and needy and broken and frightened and lonely. This is what the Lord's Prayer does to us when we pray it. Given its structure, it's bound to do that. The Lord's Prayer, after all, is a series of requests or petitions. The first three are about God, God's name, God's kingdom, and God's will. And the last three are about us, our need for daily bread, our need for forgiveness, and our need for help during times of struggle. The prayer puts us in a position of dependency. It acknowledges our neediness for God. Are you comfortable being in a dependent relationship with God? Are you really comfortable lifting up your neediness to God? I haven't watched much late night television since Johnny Carson retired, and I think that was in 1991. Following 9/11, however, I, like many other people, had trouble sleeping at night. And so I would watch some of the late night talk shows. One evening I watched David Letterman. His guest that night was Dan Rather, and they were reflecting on the atrocities that occurred that month in New York City. Dan Rather began to cry. He wept. He wiped his tears away, and then he turned to Dave and said, Dave, I'm sorry. Can we go to commercial? The screen filled with a commercial. When we once again returned to that picture of David Letterman and Dan Rather, Dan apologized. He said, I'm a seasoned professional journalist. I know better than this. I shouldn't let my emotions get the better of me. But the more they talked about 9/11, as they shared the images and the memories of that horrible day, Dan Rather, that seasoned journalist, that man who had witnessed violence and blood and mayhem in Vietnam, he began once again to cry. And then, surprising me and probably everyone in the studio audience and everyone around the country watching it, Dan Rather reached across the desk and took the hand of David Letterman. Letterman did not recoil. Letterman reached over and grasped Dan Rather's hands. And the two of them on national television wept and shared their grief and their loss and their need. In the Lord's Prayer, we are invited to lift up to God the depths of those kinds of needs and hurts and pains. The Lord's Prayer gets us in touch with our mortality, our neediness, and our brokenness. If Jesus had asked me for my advice on the Lord's Prayer, I would have done it differently. Are you comfortable with the Lord's Prayer? I'm not sure I am. Take care.